development, which itself is something that came up post-World War II as an ideology to be imposed all over the world from United States and Europe for their own reconstruction of the economy after the Second World War. There's a very interesting history of that, which I won't get into because we don't have the time here. But essentially, this whole notion of developing countries, underdeveloped countries, developed countries, so the linearity of what it means to be progress and what it means to be developed is something that came in around that time. And we've all kind of swallowed it without really seriously questioning it. But it's an ideology, it's a model that is extremely violent. It is extremely violent for all sorts of ecosystems and species. As we know, you people are very familiar with that. Anybody who's working on biodiversity would know that. But it's also extremely violent for communities. Communities that are especially dependent on nature for their day-to-day livelihood, survival, for their cultural sustenance and so on. And eventually for all of us, even if we are not in that day-to-day kind of dependence on a natural ecosystem. It is violent. In India alone, for instance, something like 60 million people have been displaced by this model of development, whether it's mining or dams or highways or urban growth, etc. What is also important is to look at the sort of underlying forces behind this kind of growth-based model of development and economic globalization that we've seen. Because it's not enough to simply look at the symptoms and say, okay, we might be losing forest somewhere, let's plant trees somewhere else. Or we might be creating waste somewhere, let's recycle it. Or we might be emitting carbon somewhere, let's make sure we capture it somewhere else. These are the kinds of superficial solutions that the system is giving us, because it doesn't want us to challenge the fundamental structures which are causing this kind of a phenomenon in the first place. And those are structures of the concentration of power, the power to dominate, the power to take decisions in the hands of corporations, in capitalism, in the hands of nation state governments, in a sort of a statist society, in the hands of men vis-a-vis women, in patriarchy, in the hands of some so-called upper castes over so-called lower castes in India. You can think of racism, etc. And then overall in the hands of humanity vis-a-vis the rest of nature. And so it's these structures and relations of domination which really need to be challenged if we want to think seriously about both human rights and the rights of the rest of nature. We also see that this is a model in which democratic spaces keep shrinking. The resurgence of right-wing authoritarian forces around the world. In India, for instance, if people like us challenge this model of development, we get labeled not just as anti-development, but now increasingly as anti-national, as terrorists, as being in the hands of foreign agents who want to stop India from developing, etc., etc. And we know that every week, some 5 to 10 people get killed somewhere in the world for simply defending their lands, their forests, their territories against mining or other such so-called development projects. So in that sense, this development is also a shrinking of democracy. At the same time, what we've seen, and this is very interesting, is we've seen a model of conservation since colonial times, but again, especially in the last few decades, that not only does not challenge this dominant model of development, but actually displaces and dispossesses communities even further. Typically, for instance, in India, if let's say a dam is to be built and a forest is to be submerged, or mining has to happen and forest has to be cut down, the government will say, okay, plant X number of trees or plant double the amount of area that you are destroying. Now, where is that going to be planted? You plant it in people's fields or in places which are so-called wastelands, which people are using. So first of all, people get displaced by the dam or the mine, and then they again get displaced by the so-called compensatory afforestation or other ecological compensation methods that are prescribed. Or we say, okay, set up a protected area. You're destroying a forest here, make sure that a tiger reserve is set up somewhere else. Or and the latest joke, for instance, the Great Nicobar Island is being threatened, one of the most ecologically important and one of the most socially fragile areas of the country, of India, is being threatened with ports and commercial expansion and things like that. And they are de-reserving a national park for that. And where will the compensatory afforestation happen? Not in the Nicobars, not in the Andaman Islands, but somewhere in Madhya Pradesh in central India. It's a total joke, but that's precisely the mindset that we're up against. And then when these protected areas are set up, as we've seen across the whole world, using the model of the Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Teton National Park in the United States from the late 1800s, across the world, conservation has spread, which is exclusionary, which says people and wildlife cannot coexist. So if there are people living in forests or wetlands or wherever, then they have to be moved out, or their activities have to be curtailed. And millions of people have been displaced in the process. So in that sense, you see that both neoliberal development and neoliberal conservation are hand in glove. And you see that even more in some of the latest proposals that are coming in, including those which are in front of the Biodiversity Convention, such as this half Earth, that is at least half of the Earth should be protected only for nature, or 30 by 30, which means 30% of the Earth should be protected by 2030. Now, it sounds good. It sounds good because, you feel that, okay, at least some attention is finally being given to nature. But actually, the model is still very much the same. Which 50%? Where will the people who are living in this 50% go? Why? What about the rest of the 50% where if you do business as usual, ultimately the climate collapse and the biodiversity collapse will affect this 50% also? So these fundamental questions of both development and of who takes decisions, who protects nature, in what form, they don't get addressed in these sorts of models. So now what's the alternative? And I'll focus for the next 5-6 minutes on that, because I think that's really the most important part here. If you look at conservation, for the last 20 years at least, we have been trying to promote, and fortunately under the Biodiversity Convention, for instance, that has been accepted, that the best conservation is that which is led by indigenous peoples and or other local communities, farmer communities, fisher communities, etc. It's when their own knowledge systems are built upon, their own governance systems are built upon, revived, repaired where they have been broken. And you can add to that, of course, modern knowledge and modern methods if relevant. Then that is the most powerful way of actually protecting, conserving nature, even as people are able to sustain and enhance their own livelihoods. So we have tens of thousands of what we call territories of life. Used to be called community conserved areas or indigenous peoples and community conserved areas, ICCAs. And a consortium which has grown with more than 150 organizations around the world now, the ICCA consortium, has documented thousands of these examples, some very, very large, millions and millions of hectares, some might be just a single, 2 hectares in size. But each of them is where communities are showing that with their own governance methods, their own management rules, their own knowledge, with, as I said, also external inputs where necessary, this kind of a conservation can take place. You have indigenous protected areas in many parts of the world. You have ancestral domain territories in the Philippines. You have locally managed marine areas across the Southern Pacific. You have community forest rights, forest resources and community forests in India and Nepal, and so on and so forth. Across the world, you'll find these. Even with mobile indigenous nomadic territories, there are these sorts of places. So that's a powerful alternative to the exclusionary model of conservation, which we really must promote. Then we come to alternatives to development itself. And I'm not saying sustainable development here, because I think that's a contradiction in terms, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about it. I'm saying alternatives to development itself, which means alternative ways of looking at human well-being. What does it mean for a person or a community to have progress? What does it mean to be fundamentally human? What does it mean to be human in the midst of nature? To be Homo sapiens, an intelligent species, not a dumb one, which is what we have been, unfortunately. It means that we have to actually revive many ancient notions of good living, such as buen vivir in Latin America, Ubuntu, etc. in Africa, Swaraj in India, Kyosai in Japan, Shohaj in Bangladesh. The notion of country by Aboriginal peoples in Australia. There's dozens of them. There's a whole pluriverse of these sorts of alternative worldviews, which are also based on solid, grounded practice of how you can live sustainably with the earth and in peace with each other. And then there are many that are coming out of the industrialized world. So you have, for instance, degrowth from from Europe, or you have ecofeminism from many parts of the world, you have eco-socialism, you have transition movements, you have the commons movement. All of these, in one way, in their own diverse ways, are kind of showing us how we can meet human needs and aspirations and be satisfied and be happy and be in peace with ourselves and with other people and with the rest of nature, without causing the kind of destruction that the current models are creating. Decentralized water sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, um, local governance, direct democracy, gender justice movements. There's so many. I mean, there's lots and lots of them. I'll put a link in the chat later on of a book that we just came out with called Pluriverse, which has 100 examples of these. Now, the last point I want to make here, coming back to the issue of rights, is that the notion, if you look at all of these successful examples of sort of inspiring examples, and quickly to mention that not all of these are, none of these are perfect. They all have their own issues, but they all show us the potential for the kind of transformation that we want. If you look at them, there are 2 or 3 very crucial elements across all of them. One, that they're based on thinking of human existence and the rest of nature as part of the commons, part of a collective, not individualized, privatized bits and pieces of land and forest and knowledge and so on, but like everything in that sense in the commons, where the individual is important, but is part of a collective. As they say with Ubuntu in Southern Africa, I am because we are. You know, there's a sense of the collective. So collective rights, and this is where, for instance, the Western notion of human rights, which is the foundation of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, progressive as it is and important as it is not adequate. And this is why, for instance, indigenous peoples argued for their own United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is focused much more on collective rights. And so this combination of individual human rights, of course, I want my life to be protected, but also that I want my community to thrive, is something that is a very crucial component of these sorts of alternative examples. Then from that follows, and you have many different UN treaties on this. I just mentioned 2. There's also, of course, the more recent one on non-indigenous or small peasants, small farmers, fishers, etc., which extends itself to non-indigenous communities also. From those also flow a number of national level laws and policies, such as, for instance, in India, finally the recognition of community forest rights after 150 years of colonial and post-colonial centralization of forest governance in the hands of the state, to say, okay, now it is communities that have the rights to manage their community forests in a collective way. So you have that. You have the recognition of local community governance in many different ways. I mentioned, for instance, ancestral domains in the Philippines. There are different ways by which these are recognized. But neither the UN nor national laws and policies will be successful unless, of course, there's also people's mobilization. That is the most crucial element to this. Collective mobilization by peoples wherever they are, in whatever form, both in villages and in cities, to claim these rights, because they are inherent to us. They're not something that government is giving us as charity, but to claim them and then to be able to conserve nature based on that. Also be responsible, not to claim them and then cut down the whole forest, but to actually be responsible towards each other and towards the rest of nature. And then the final point, and I'll shift over to Shrishtee then after the question answer.
Our letter bandide.
Roy, mute your mic. So yeah, so the final point I think is that in all of this, also very crucial is the recognition of alternative worldviews. I already mentioned many of them, but to say that, you know, what we're up against in terms of the sort of dominant Western modernization worldview, if you can think of it as a worldview, is a materialist, exploitative, commodified, commercialized, individualized, privatized world. As up against that, we have hundreds of alternative worldviews which are based on the kinds of things I'm talking about, based on the values of solidarity, the value of collective, the value of respect for diversity, the value of generosity and love, the value of autonomy and freedom, but with responsibility, rights and responsibilities. Long ago, Gandhiji was asked, what does he think about human rights? He says, the first thing that comes is duties and then rights. Am I performing my duty towards you? And one can extend that to say, am I performing my duty towards the rest of nature? And then I can claim my rights. We can think of it either way around, but they go together. So it's those worldviews which then look at the rest of nature also with respect, and they're ancient. So in that sense, the sort of more recent move of granting rights, legal rights to the rest of nature are or should be founded on these ancient views of mutual respect. And that's the final thing I'd like to say here. And Shrishtee, I'm sure, is going to elaborate on this much more. Thank you again for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashish, for the wonderful and insightful views and sharing your experience directly from your heart. It's really like we could actually understand a part of what you are trying to say. Well, before I just open the floor, I have always this question in my mind, what is the difference between human rights and nature rights, and how are they complementary? It's a very simple question I have, if you can just.
Bharat, my suggestion is we should park this question for Shrishti's presentation, and then after that, when we have the final round of questions, we can get to it. Because let's all understand both concepts, and then we come back to this. It's a very important question, so make sure you raise it again after Shrishti. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Shrishtee, I think you can just start your. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat, for inviting me. Really glad to be here with you all. And so I'll share a presentation. Just a second. Let me know once you can see it. Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, Ashish has set the context for the presentation quite aptly. So I will not repeat some of the things that he has already mentioned. What I want to focus is on the rights of nature part, what the movement is about, what's happening across the world, and what is it questioning, what it must question, and how do we move forward from where we are right now. But as Ashish was saying, there's a whole larger context that we need to understand to argue, as we have argued in the past, for human rights, and also now arguing for rights of nature. One is that the current laws and policies have been actually the discourse of environmental governance in India, in South Asia, and across the world has largely been that these laws and policies have been used as means to sanction environmental destruction rather than actually challenging those. And we know they've been used as a convenient facade to get away with development, extractive projects, displacing the communities and a lot of species. And this current ecological crisis that we find ourselves in, much more amplified with the whole COVID crisis. I mean, we can see it very clearly that we need to fundamentally rethink our dominant systems. These systems ranging from the kind of centralized political governance we have, to the kind of conservation models we have, to the kind of economic systems we live in, and also a lot of social inequalities that we find ourselves in. And so all of these need to be questioned to be actually be able to mitigate the kind of crisis, ecological crisis we are facing. And it is signaling a shift from an extractive, colonial, and property-oriented mindset to where nature is looked at something as what a lot of indigenous and nature-dependent communities have articulated, of looking at nature in a respectful way, in reverence and sacredness, of what, say, the Lepcha community in Northeast India relates to the river, in saying that after they're passing on, they go to the river, and hence a dam cannot be built on a river that is so sacred to them. As for Zapatistas, the Sissiks tribe in US, and many other communities who have been articulating their reciprocity, interdependence, and relational worldview with the rest of nature. And importantly, as you see in that picture, that mostly our policies and laws and governance and conservation mechanisms are focused on humans as being at the top of the pyramid, and then species down below. But we are looking at, and humans are just part of the larger nature, and so it has to we have to realize that we are nature, and it's this healthy interconnected web of life that we are really talking about when we're talking and arguing for rights of nature. Now, why certain things, especially in the Indian context, I just want to mention these in a little more detail, and then I will also share just what's happening across the world. So in 2017, the Uttarakhand High Court, which is one of the North Indian states in India, passed a judgment recognizing the rights of river Ganga and Yamuna. These are two very important sacred rivers in the Indian plains. And the glaciers, Gangotri and Yamunotri glaciers, where these rivers originate from, as having rights like that of a legal person, with all corresponding duties, rights, liabilities of a living person. Subsequently, in 2008, the same High Court ruled that the entire animal kingdom has rights equivalent to that of a living person. And last year, in March 2020, Punjab and Haryana Court, which is one of the another northwest states in India, declared the Sukhna Lake in the city of Chandigarh as having rights as that of a living entity. Can people please mute their mics? Okay. What's happening also in the neighboring parts of neighboring countries to India. So in 2019, the Turag River in Bangladesh, which flows through the city of Dhaka, was granted rights as that of a legal person. And in fact, the court issued quite interesting directives on how to protect the rivers, and it was later made applicable to all the rivers. There are similar attempts being made in Nepal to grant rights to the river, to Mount Everest, in Pakistan to grant rights to river Indus. Some interesting efforts in Bhutan. So there are some interesting processes happening in the South Asian region, and I'm emphasizing region because I'll later elaborate why a regional approach to something like this is so crucial. Now, this is a worldwide movement. In Ecuador in 2008, when the revolution happened and the constitution was changed, rights of nature was recognized in their constitution. Subsequently, with the Cambamba River in Ecuador was also granted rights. In the US, several counties passed ordinances recognizing the rights of local lakes, rivers, mountains, some sacred spaces. Bolivia, another Latin American country, passed law of rights of Pachamama, that is the Mother Earth, and they also there was also an interesting process of recognizing of actually drafting a whole legislation and declaration on rights of Mother Earth. In Colombia, biocultural rights of River Atrato were given. Now again, River Atrato is one of the very important tributaries of the river Amazon. And then the rights of Amazon region were recognized also. Why I want to emphasize this particular example was that it was very closely connected to the rights of future generations. Again, the human rights elements to the human right element to it, where the petitioners argued that the future generations have right to live, and destroying of Amazon region, destruction of Amazon region is curtailing our right to live, and also the generation that is not yet born. Then the Ho-Chunk Nation in the US was the first tribal nation to vote for rights of nature. New Zealand passed the Ti Urewara and Tivi Avatupa Act. Tivi Avara was recognizing the rights of a national park, and Tivi Avatupa Act was recognizing the rights of a Wanganui River. Now, Wanganui River and the ecosystem was granted rights as that of a legal person. Again, want to emphasize this in conjunction with the Indian example. Why? Because this process emerged out of 150 years of struggle of local indigenous Iwi people, and the Crown, which is the New Zealand government, recognized for all the wrong they have done in the past to the people, to the communities, and to the ecosystems, and hence undoing that wrong by actually recognizing the rights of the entire ecosystem, which has been such a sacred space for the local people, and they say it and they articulate it as we are the river and the river is us, which is basically there is no difference in humans and rivers. So latest very interesting examples emerging from rights of Magpie River in Quebec, Canada being granted, interesting processes of granting rights to wild rice, also some efforts being made on granting rights to moon with, and as a response to what new ideas of colonizing moon are emerging, and several efforts, I'm sure you guys are part of these networks and would know of them being made in Sweden, UK, Australia, and Europe, and so many parts of the world. So it's a much larger movement that is emerging across the world. Now, what I want to focus on for next few minutes is some opportunities and questions that this movement raises for us. And I will focus right now on the reverse perspective only, but it applies to the larger rest of nature perspective as well. One is that what is a river? There hasn't been a very consolidated effort, I can say that, for India and also the rest of South Asia. That there is no consolidated effort on defining what is a river and what all constitutes a river. A lot of communities actually articulate that in their local ways and interpretations, and how they see river as an ecosystem, as a civilization. But at a legal policy level, there is no consolidated effort. Neither do these judgments actually do. Very few judgments actually get into this very important question. And what does it mean for a river, its associated natural elements, the species in it, the flora and fauna, to have rights as that of a person? Now, you and I have right of fundamental right to speech, to live. What does it really mean for a river? Would it mean for a river to flow? Or would it mean to maintain its ecological balance? I mean, what are those rights as that of a person? Now, legal personhood status, there's a lot of contention, there's a lot of debate around using this as the tool to actually further the rights of nature. Are we getting into the whole anthropocentric approach? And how do such rights be implemented, given that the rivers cannot represent themselves in the court? Who represent those rights? And what implications do these rights have, not just on rivers, but people living along them, the communities, and our relationship with the rest of nature? And what will be the implementation of the cross-boundary rivers, the transnational rivers? What does it really mean to grant rights, for example, to rivers, to River Indus, which flows through India, Pakistan, China? What does it really mean when we talk about rivers that are flowing nationally and internationally, not really following the man-made boundaries? And I think one important question that is for all of us is that the law, and I think it's a valid question to ask in a way, that if all these environmental policies that have been made until now have not actually protected the environment, rather have been used as means to sanction destruction, can now actually resolve these contested articulations and can resolve our in a strange relationship with the rest of nature, between culture, nature, between development and environment. And what we want to emphasize is that it can, if it begins questioning the extractive development growth model. If you don't fundamentally question the destruction, the sanctioning of these development projects, we cannot really move towards really truly granting rights of nature. It has to question centralized political decision making. The communities need to be empowered. They need to be recognized as custodians of their natural ecosystems. Their decisions, their opinions, their viewpoints, they have to be part of the decision making processes. They cannot be ignored. And so do civil society actors, people like us, people who are interested in protecting nature need to be part of the consultative processes. We need to question our anthropocentric legal framework. The legal framework is so human-centered until now that we really have very limited tools and scope to actually bring about radical changes. So we need to transform and rethink about what kind of a legal framework would actually support this. And going beyond rights. So rights is just an entry to a larger transformation that we are looking for. It's not an end, it's means towards an end. And what lies ahead? This is possibly my last big slide, and then we can move on to questions and more conversation. We need much more awareness, campaigning, and advocacy on something like this. If we think that this could be a potential legal and political policy strategy that can be used to advance rights of rivers or nature, and at a broader South Asian level, why focus on a regional level rather than India level or country level is because nature is not necessarily following man-made boundaries. So we need to question those and actually retune these boundaries in much more that are in semblance with the rest of nature rather than having it too human-centered. We can use international laws like the Convention of Biodiversity, Convention on Migratory Species, Ramsar, to argue for rights of rivers and rights of nature, which could supersede the national laws. Then one important relationship which is related to the idea of the legal frameworks is the relationship between customary traditional laws and any such law on rights of rivers and rights of nature, which needs to be studied more because they're so, in many ways also, this bridge has not been built where these two very different aspects can actually be brought together. And so this relationship needs to be explored more. There's a lot of groundwork that is needed through education. And I was earlier saying that we need to reimagine governance from ecological point of view. So imagining bioregions, ecoregions, and supporting a lot of local efforts. So wherever we are, we might be in cities, we might be we are all over the world. I guess it's a global audience, and sometimes we feel that it is some pristine environment that needs to be protected. But we might be in cities, and there are rivers, there are lakes, and there are local bodies that need protection. There are species that need protection. So what can we do to support such local processes? Is something that we can think about wherever we are located. Last, I want to present or let you know about various global networks that Bharat, thanks. Okay.
Yes.
So I just want to highlight some networks that you can follow, whose work you can look at, be connected to if you're interested in this process. And they're doing some amazing work, very interesting work that you can be associated with and know more about this movement. The other group that I am part of, it's the Rights of Rivers South Asia Alliance, that is looking at rights of nature processes, rights of rivers processes in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and what does it mean to look at giving rights to nature and rights to rivers in this region. And just this last cartoon, which is Chalakudi Rivers is a South Indian river, and it is being threatened. And one of the cartoons that was made, which is basically the key argument of this whole movement, that if can the river have a right to flow freely, just as you and I have a right to live, right to speech. So really looking at the whole rest of nature as being able to live, thrive, perform its ecological functions, exist, persist, and so looking at these rights as being as intrinsic to nature, but also in this current framework that we have. Over to you, Bharat, and thanks everybody for listening, and maybe we can explore more when we get to the question and answers.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee. It's really fantastic to see and inspiring to see actually that you did a lot of research about the entire world, and I just wanted to also say that Shrishtee is going to speak as a speaker during the IUCN Global Youth Summit. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wish you all the best for that. And now I think I just open the floor to the participants now for Q&A. I can see Amelia raised a question there. How can we keep the spirit up if it seems that by a step that we take towards harmony with nature, the inertia of destruction is stronger? She continues to say, how can we demand rights if most of our societies ignore them and are increasingly in a more extreme situation of violence and poverty, alienation and disinformation? And as much as we want to reach many people, few are willing to change and give up your privileges. So over to you, anyone, either Ashish or Shrishtee, you can address her.
Thanks, Amelia, for the question. Ashish, is it okay if I take this and then you can add?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I totally agree, and especially as young person and people who have to live in this world, it's quite actually disheartening to see what's happening, and at times all our efforts seem going in vain. But having said that, I think there are also so many interesting processes of struggle and resistance and transformations that you see on the ground, that actually renew your hope in the future and also towards these struggles. And the problem is that they are not visibilized enough. They don't find a space in the mainstream media. They don't even find enough space within the civil society, within groups and people like us who are interested in these issues. We have for long, as people interested in these processes and wanting to transform and change the world, focused a lot on what we are up against, whereas very limited focus is given on what amazing processes that people are doing, challenging these destructive developments, and also doing processes of transformation. There's one such example that I've been so inspired by in Central India, that people who have been facing mining and heavy destruction in their sacred and territorial forests have actually resisting against that destruction, have also started moving towards much more holistic transformations of looking at how do we organize ourselves collectively, claim our rights over our forests, how do we protect our forests, how do we manage these commons, also look at internal injustices where the systems have been repressive to women, and all claim their control over their livelihoods, over their commons. And this is all happening in extreme threat and state repression, but they're doing so. And this is just one example, and there are many such, not just in India, not just in South Asia, but across the world. And this is what the process like Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which both Ashish and I are part of, is trying to actually bring together many networks of alternatives at the global level to come together and really see what these various processes are, what we can learn collectively. And also there's lots of young people wanting to change. I mean, all 36 people here are also there, and so this is something that we can bank upon and see that uh, this is some positivity, and people can really bring about change if they're truly committed to, and if we can bring ourselves in collectivize.
Maybe just add a thing, observation there to what Shrishtee already said, agreeing with everything she said, which is that I think if one looks at the history of social movements, social, political, cultural, ecological movements in the last maybe, let's say, 100, 200 years, um, a lot of these movements have also faced these crises because they're up against forces which are much more powerful. If you take, for instance, just the women's movement, right? The fact that there are, I don't know how many of the 35 people here are women, but 50 years back, 100 years back, if we had this session, obviously not online, but in some other form, uh, there would have been far fewer women because the spaces that have been created by the women's movement or the feminist movement or the gender movements have enabled a lot more women to actually be occupying spaces which otherwise were not available. That doesn't mean patriarchy is gone. Of course not. There's many horrible elements of it still around. And sometimes it comes back with much greater force. But I think that in the last 100 years, there's been substantial changes in that. The second example I can give you is maybe at the beginning of the 20th century, let's say 1901, if we had this conference, and this question would have been asked, how do we deal with colonial powers? Everything, the whole world is colonized, and they're so powerful. England is ruling half the world. And we would have, been sort of desperate saying, oh gosh, yeah, maybe we can't really do anything. But you see then within the next 20, 30, 40 years, how colonies were actually thrown out, colonizers were actually thrown out. Again, that doesn't mean that the world became suddenly much better, but very, very powerful forces were fought against with small movements starting, becoming bigger and bigger and joining up together and being able to kick out a lot of the colonizing powers. So I think if we take those kinds of examples, and the third thing I think which is really, really, really important is that probably for the first time in human history, we now have a sense of one Earth. We know with the kind of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and so on, that something we do in one part of the Earth affects something 3,000 miles or kilometers away. And we know the mechanics of how that happens, not everything, but at least some of it. And therefore, the realization that it's one Earth is a very powerful, both conscious and subconscious force that we should be using to make the changes that we need to make, which otherwise is very difficult. If we think of ourselves as being isolated populations, etc., is that much more difficult to get action taken on let's say pesticides that poison penguins in the Arctic, or something carbon emissions in the US, which are creating problems in the Himalaya in India and Nepal. So, but now we have a lot of that much better sense, and I think that's something which we should use. Bharat, did you want to go back to your first question also at some point?
Yes, Ashish. Thank you so much for this. Yes, I think I was asking about the difference between human rights and nature rights, and how are they complementary?
Shrishtee, you want to take that, or should I go ahead?
You go ahead. I'll add if need be.
Okay, we can keep shifting who's first and who's second. So yeah, I think, see, if we look at human rights in the modern Western way, which is of individual human rights, like I was mentioning earlier, then there could be a potential conflict with the rights of the rest of nature, in the sense that if I, in order to live my life with the way I want to define it, with human freedom and so on and so forth, and material consumption and etc., whatever I think of as being progress, then it's quite possible that I will be impinging on other species, probably also other human beings. But if we were to think of human rights as both individual and collective, which is what I was trying to point to, if you were to take the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a model that kind of within which the UN Declaration on Human Rights should be encompassed, then you actually begin to see that that human rights, the right to be free, to be happy, to be satisfied, to have all my basic needs being met, etc., etc., the right of freedom from violence, etc., that all of this not only can be met by respecting the rights of the rest of nature, but in fact only will be met when you respect the rights of the rest of nature. Because if you don't do that, then my collective rights are going to undermine somebody else's collective rights. Yeah. So let's take a simple example. If I'm an upstream village in a river, and I say, okay, I'm going to dam the river because I want as much water to grow, sugarcane and other water guzzling crops, the village downstream is going to be negatively impacted because they won't have enough water. Now, if I have a selfish notion of what progress is and development is, that's what I will do. I could do that as an individual, or I could do that as a small collective also. But if I'm thinking the notion of responsibility also, and if I'm saying that, no, I also respect the rights of nature, which means I'm going to keep the forests in the catchment area intact, and I'm going to let the river flow free, which is what Shrishtee was indicating as rights of rivers, then it means that the downstream village also has access to the water, and all the way down to the sea where it flows out. And all the species along the way also have access. So I think this is how one would look at some differences, but also the complementarity between the two.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashish. I see Yash raised his hand.
And also
Yes, you
Rahul
can
has
ask a
questions in
question.
the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. My question revolves around the thing that I agree with all that has been said. My question is basically what I understand is that to solve the biodiversity issue, we have to look at a certain specific region, because even in one country there, like let's take India for example alone, you have different ecosystems all across different places, and these ecosystems are very like they vary from each other quite prominently. So to solve the biodiversity issue, we need to understand how each ecosystem functions, how each animal, what role they play, and how we humans can actually understand that and actually adapt to that, so that we coexist, and we that will also be a result to tackle climate change as well. Now, that's what I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong. My question is, how can we make that happen? And also, there's like, as you pointed out, what we do in one part of the world may have another impact in another part of the world, which we call problem shifting. How do we counter that when we are implementing this approach?
Thanks, Yash, for your question. Yeah, I mean, totally agree that we need a regional approach, and that's what we were trying highlighting, that to be able to actually think about rights of nature, it's crucial that we think about it in a very regional perspective, because nature is contiguous. It is not really following the nation boundaries or district boundaries within nations or whatever it is, and that would require a much much more different conceptualization amongst people who is working on these issues, but also of how we approach the administration, because this is going to fundamentally question the state. It was going to fundamentally question the structures that we currently live in, and the kind of political governance models that we have in India, for example, and also many parts of the world. So this has to, and so how will that happen? And I think, in my personal opinion, that can only happen if we have these global processes or regional processes of collaborations, dialogues between people to people. So how can people, and there are so many actually regional processes dialogue processes, peace processes, youth collective processes of people coming together and talking about what does it mean to be part of a South Asia region. How can we build peace collaborations based on ecological grounds? China, India cannot continue fighting because it is not sustainable for anyone, and not for the humans, not for the future generations, not for the rest of the environment. So what can people of these two countries really do to build that regional collaboration and perspective? And there is a role that as networks we need to play, as young people especially, I feel we have to play. Sorry, just muting you. As young people, that we have to play of what we can really do to build this perspective or take this approach forward. And I guess possibly Ashish can talk more about of this kind of regional approach that was adopted during drafting of the National Biodiversity Act, where a more regional planning and approach was sort of conveyed, but of course not well accepted by the current, at that time, the political administration. Ashish, over to you.
Yeah, maybe just quickly on the regional thing, and then also I think another sense of what Yash was asking was about the local. So on the bioregional or eco-regional approach, what we tried to do at that time in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process was to say, if we, this is for India, that if we were to look at, say, the entire Western Himalaya as one region, or the southern Western Ghats, the biodiversity hotspot in southern India, as one region, rather than being cut up between different states of the country. And as Shrishtee said, we can say the same thing. So if you look at the whole of the Western Himalaya across currently six countries, then what would governance be? What would it look like? How would you do from the micro, that is every village and town, to the macro, the entire landscape of 3,000, 4,000 kilometers long? What would it look like? So that was like more of a conceptual kind of exercise. And of course, we're very, very, very far away from grounding it in actual practice. But I think it's important also to be able to visualize and envision what kind of alternatives we can think of. But I think the second sense of what Yash was asking was also about the local. That is to say that every locality by region could also mean every sort of local area is also unique in some sense. If you look at it ecologically, economically, culturally, politically, etc., there are elements of human uniqueness in them. If you're a small island, you could be even more unique. If you're wherever you are, you know, depending on millions of years of evolution, you would have elements of uniqueness, of endemicity, of species, etc. And same with cultures, languages, food cuisines, etc. So how does one envision policies and programs and you know, conservation in that kind of a perspective? Yes, if I'm not mistaken, that's also something that we're asking. So one of the or two of the principles of this alternative approach, and if we get a little bit of 2-3 minutes later, I'll put up what we call this flower of transformation to be able to explain some of this a bit better. But two elements, two principles of this approach is, one is local self-reliance, and localization linked with that, which is both political and economic localization and local self-reliance, and diversity, which means that anything that is a homogeneous approach, and this includes any alternative approach also. If you say that the whole world should become Buen Vivir or Swaraj or Ubuntu, or everybody should be doing eco whatever, then that's also a problem, because it disrespects that local uniqueness and diversity. What is important is the principles. So if we say that, for instance, the principle of solidarity, or the principle of working in the commons, that principle could be common across the world, but how it applies in my context might be very different from how it applies in your context, right? So I think that's the way to approach it. Now, what is important here then is that if I am doing, and I go back to what I was saying earlier, rights and responsibilities, if I am doing something which is impinging on your local self-reliance, you should have the right and the power to say no. Now, if we look at the world today, I can certainly speak for India. I think this is true for virtually all across the world. Local communities do not necessarily have that right. In fact, mostly they don't have that right. They don't have the right to say no if the government comes in with a proposal for extracting petroleum or mining iron ore or whatever it is. Even if they do have that right on paper, it's mostly on paper. It's not actualized. Or for instance, the community outside my city of Pune, where all the garbage goes from the city and gets dumped there, doesn't have the legal right to say, no, we're not going to allow our land to be used for your garbage. You deal with it yourself, right? So I think that that thing of the notion of autonomy and the rights of self-determination, which is what indigenous peoples have fought for decades, is a very crucial part of this localization, local self-reliance, and the respect for diversity. The second important part there is what one author has called ecological intelligence, or maybe we can think of it as ecological wisdom, that should be aware, I and my community should be aware of what are the impacts of the production and consumption processes that we are engaging in. Because if I'm using an iPhone or I'm using a laptop right now, I should at least be aware of the fact that it is possibly that this laptop encompasses horrible, destructive, life-threatening mining in Congo or somewhere else, right? And then how does that intelligence or wisdom or sensitivity get built into challenging the kind of consumption patterns we have? This relates also to Rahul's question, which is a very, very important one and a very difficult one, which is that very often, and Rahul, I don't think this is only in cities, now increasingly in villages also people are living unsustainable lifestyles. We all are, probably everybody on this call is. And how do we then tackle that? And I think that's a complex, but there are solutions. I mean, from the individual lifestyle to the collective, where we can constructively challenge each other all the time and say, why are you doing it like this when you can in fact do it like this? Why are you taking a plastic carry bag when in fact you should be carrying your own cloth bag? Or why are you taking a flight instead of taking the train? Is something that often individually we may be too weak to do, but if there's a collective around me which is challenging me all the time, which is framing some sort of collective norms and rules, then it becomes a bit easier to do, and which is also providing me with solutions. I may not want to do something, but I may not actually have an alternative, right? Just to give you a quick simple example, in the last 5-6 months I've tried to not buy anything in plastic, yeah, but I do occasionally need 1 or 2 medicines. How do I get it without the metal, the whatever the kind of wrappers that it comes in? I can't. I can buy biscuits without wrappers. I can buy other things, and that also is very difficult, by the way. There is a zero waste shop near my house, but it's very expensive. So 90% of Pune probably can't afford it. So they are forced to buy waste. Yeah. So I think there's individual to collective kinds of transformations that we need in order both to respect the localization and the diversity, and to live much more responsible lives. None of which is easy, of course.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashish. We have a question on, aren't right-based framework inherently limiting won't a collective right to develop as a nation, or farmers, ranchers' right to deforest? Pranav, would you like to take the opportunity to ask the question by yourself? Can a rights of nature based on customary law and practices of indigenous people seen in resistance by such groups?
It's okay. I think we can read the question, and if Pranav can't speak, then should we go ahead and answer it? Bharat, should we go ahead and answer, or are you waiting
Yes,
for Pranav?
yes, Ashish. You can go ahead and answer.
Okay, I'll take a crack at that, and then Shrishtee, you can also.
Yeah.
So I think the sense of what I've been trying to say is that I agree that rights-based frameworks alone are in fact limiting. That is why the responsibility part of it, the duty part of it, like I said, is as important. Because if it's only based on rights, and especially individual human rights, then it is likely not to respect either other people's rights or the rights of the rest of nature. So I don't think one can argue in a rights-based framework that I have the right to destroy the forests around me because that's my right. Yeah, or I have the right to run my SUV wherever I want. I mean, that's the American notion of freedom, right? And but to my mind, that's not what rights-based frameworks are about. Rights-based frameworks, and if you look at the Forest Rights Act in India, it very clearly provides for those rights, both individual and collective, but also enjoins the community to conserve the forest. It mandates that the community must also fulfill the duty of conserving wildlife, forest, water in the forest, etc. So these things always have to go together. And in that sense, yes, perhaps customary law, traditional ways of looking at and dealing with their landscapes and seascapes could be very crucial components of the solutions we're looking for. Unfortunately, modern formal law has overtaken or displaced a lot of the customary laws. And where people are asserting their customary or collective rights, they're also asserting their customary laws. But let's also keep in mind that as wonderful as many of those customary practices are, especially in relation to the rest of nature, they can also be extremely unequal within human society itself. They can be extremely, for instance, patriarchal, or in the Indian context, very upper casteist, right? So we may need, and I think maybe Shrishtee can talk about how the indigenous people in Korchi, the example she gave, are not just challenging the external world's imposition of their worldview and mining, etc., but also changing themselves internally because they realize that there are also problems in customary ways of doing things or traditional ways of doing things. So I think it's really this whole combination of responsibility and rights, combination of those elements of tradition and custom which are still extremely relevant, especially in relation to the rest of nature, but also some elements of modern human rights or collective rights that need to be brought in. It's that combination. It's the hybrid systems of traditional knowledge and modern knowledge, etc. Perhaps that we need in different forms across the world.
Thank you, Ashish. Shrishtee, you would like to add?
Yeah, just quickly one or two points. I think Ashish has covered much of it, but I just want to say that that's why we've been highlighting that rights of nature movement cannot be cannot really be realized until it questions the fundamentals. So collective right to a destructive development, which is based on exploitation of nature, would not uh, and could not be in conjunction with something like rights of nature. Rights of nature of indigenous people, even if it's a huge majority's collective right, that cannot be at the cost of rights of nature. It cannot be at the cost of rights of indigenous peoples, or local nature dependent communities to exist, to live, or to thrive. So a collective right to develop cannot be at the cost of the basic fundamental right, which is what I want to emphasize, that the rights of framework, the rights framework is limiting, but it is going to be, one needs to see what are the fundamental rights, what collective right, collective granting of collective right is going to impact fundamental rights. And that is why the whole rights of nature movement needs to redefine rights in a much more nature's intrinsic value and worth, rather than doing it in a anthropocentric human lens. And that is something that we will have to also think more about as a whole movement and discourse on rights of nature. What does it really mean, as I was saying, for a river to have a right, not as a legal person, but as a river, what it would mean. And that's one example, that river has a right to flow freely, when you look at as a fundamental right to live. But that could be very different for species, communities, and that cannot be overpowered by a collective right or collective rights. Yeah, over to you, Bharat.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee. I just like open the session to everyone. So like I just want to continue. I just want to share my experience working with indigenous people. So I worked in central India and also in Maharashtra. So maybe Ashish, you can enlighten me later. See what I see. I have this hobby of writing stories about people, observing the psychology. I I saw, for example, Biodiversity Act 2002 empowers the local communities to create BMCs, that is biodiversity management committees. Now that committee is giving certain power to the communities at the ground level, local level. But I saw many times, this is my observation, let's say the local MLA, the local legislator may not allow sometimes the local communities to empower, and he belongs to their community itself. So this internal struggles, I find many times, many parts of the world, I mean, we can link with other parts of the world also. And so how, let's say the other point we have is the fundamental right 21. The right in the Menaka case simply says that right to live with human dignity, right to decent environment, right to livelihood. The fundamental right is granting you to live with some decent life. But now we can have all these laws, UN laws, CVD, post 2020, everything. But if I am not aware, and if the implementation part is not done, if the rights are given to certain people and communities, and they have the right to go to the judiciary. So, but you know that mostly they won't go till there. Maybe they are not aware, or what is that? I'm not sure. So how can we address this empowering challenges? So this is my observation. I just want to share my experience. You can enlighten me on that.
Shrishtee, is it your turn or mine?
I think it is your turn. But I can take the first question maybe, and Ashish, you can take the second one. Is that okay?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Bharat, for your question, and I think that is something that all of us observe while we work at local levels and with communities. That sometimes it is local people. Mm, the village headman, somebody who belongs to the community, or even if not really having say administrative powers, just on a different side of which potentially is destructive to the local communities, and we see it so many times. But I think it is a part of a larger problem, wherein as soon as you have power, even if it has local level, it is much about, okay, as a MLA, as a village head, you get the decision making powers, and it's very little in control as a collective, as people, or what decisions we can take. So it's fundamentally also, I think, a structural problem, where the power rests usually at individuals or a group of individuals, as we see in the panchayati raj systems also. And that is why this whole movement of granting rights to decision making, empowering gram sabhas, which is a collective or area sabhas in cities. Sabhas are, since it's a global audience, so gram sabhas are village assemblies, and area sabhas are area assemblies in the cities. So very smaller units of decision making. So this with these amendments and empowerment, those dissolving of actually power to the collective is where the strengthening has to happen. Most of what we see in India and also other parts of the world, that strengthening is not happening. But there are, and that's where in central India, that I have been part of, and also along with many other colleagues, where actually people have got together to strengthen their local village assemblies. Not really dependent on the state elected representatives who they have voted to power, but including them also, of course, in the decision making, but really empowering the local village assemblies and taking decisions, taking ownership, and arguing for autonomy and self-governance at that level, at a very small level of 50, 40, 70 households. And this process, what they've really done is that they formed a federation of 90 villages, and have done this in a collective way, parallel to the state administrative process. But that doesn't mean that they're not engaging with the state administration, but finding ways of negotiation in a way, dialogue in a way, where they can actually protect, conserve their forests, generate local livelihoods, empower themselves, collectivize, but also engage with the state representation. So balancing that power. So one sees that it is really local processes of empowerment, where a little role is also played by people from outside, people doing these engagements, people bringing this sense of what these laws and policies are to the people. And so it's a complex web of processes that helps people, and also they're taking the ownership of those.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add to that is, the story that Shrishtee has just told of this Mahagram Sabha, the sort of collective of village assemblies in central India. I think, and this is also in response to Srinidhi's very, very crucial question of how do we inspire people, young people, to get out of deadlyhoods. That's a term that I wrote about 3 or 4 years back and seems to be catching up. So I think what's important is telling stories, and we haven't been very good at it. As environmentalists, I think we haven't really been that good at telling stories. We've been too cerebral in our messaging. Whereas if you look at the corporate advertising world, or say the right wing sort of religious nationalist world, or whatever, in any country, they don't approach things in a very heady manner. They actually get straight to the heart or the emotions, and which is why they're so successful, which we haven't really done enough of. So for instance, telling the story that Shrishtee just told, telling it in multiple different ways, as narratives coming from, say, young people in those communities, as films, as audio, as theater, as whatever forms we can use. And now that the so-called social media is available to hundreds of millions of people, using those also. This is, I think, at least for us here, it's a late realization that we really have not done enough of that. Graphic novels, cartoons, there's so much that is possible, art, music. And I think we need to be able to tell these inspiring stories. What young people are doing. We're just putting together right now, for instance, a document on 10, 12 very inspiring stories of what the youth did during the COVID period in different parts of India to sustain the resilience of their communities and their livelihoods and food and so on. Now, supposing we're able to put together 500 such stories from around the world, and to put them out in different ways, probably it would inspire those who are stuck in the vicious cycle of deadlyhoods, as Srinidhi has put it, to say, oh yeah, maybe there is an alternative. It's not just abstract and theoretical, but actually, in fact, there are people who are doing it, practicing. They're not starving, they're not being deprived, but of course, they're not super rich and building 27-story single-family houses, but they're enjoying themselves. And that's what's important, right? And they're actually combining work and leisure. We're not separating the two. This is what I wrote when I wrote that thing on deadlyhoods, that the modern Western world has told us work is different from leisure and pleasure. So you have 9 to 5, and then you go home and enjoy yourself, and then you have a weekend in which you enjoy yourself, but rest of the time you're like, and that's why yesterday I was talking to somebody who said that, oh, we need to compensate people. I said, why compensation? Why is there a word called compensation for honorarium? If we're enjoying doing what we're doing and we get paid for it, it's an honorarium. It's not a compensation. It's not something that's like I'm sacrificing my life and therefore I'm getting compensated for it. So there's multiple different ways. We have to show how livelihoods for the youth, for elderly, for whoever, can actually be empowering, fun, enjoyable, creative. I'll just end with one quote that I have from a young uh, handloom weaver in Kutch in Western India. He's come back into weaving. He had gone off to work in a factory, and then he came back and started doing handloom weaving with his family. And I asked him, I said, why did you not stay there or go off into IT or something like that? And he said, my handloom, on which I'm making the cloth, is my computer. And it's actually more than your computers, because when I'm working on it, I have to use my head, my hands, and my heart all together. So I was a little puzzled. I said, I can understand head because you need to remember, patterns and things like that. And I can understand hands because obviously you're making something with your hands. Why the heart? He said, because if I don't put my heart into this product, you as a customer will not like it. So now, that, to me, that's actually the way in which we can inspire people of any age to actually try out things which maybe their ancestors were already doing. Maybe we do it differently. So for instance, this guy is not just doing what his ancestors have been doing. He's also using a GPS or whatever, some sort of system to be able to make sure that he can get across to some markets. So as I said, hybrid systems. These are the ones that can actually inspire people to get out of the sort of drudgery of deadlihoods that unfortunately most of us are stuck in. And stories become so very important there. So anybody out there amongst you 30 people, if you have powerful, creative ways of telling stories, please let us know, because we want you. We have 1,500 stories on the India website, vikalpsangam.org. I'll write it in the chat. And we have hundreds from the rest of the world. And they need to get out there in different forms.
Great. Thank you, Ashish, for bringing this particular topic, art, bringing art to the environment sector, which is very important. I see that I also got trained in theater during my college days, and I understand power of storytelling, but I never, on very few occasions, I saw people who are doing theater on environment, like in the modern theater, like the Russian playwright who wrote, I'm unable to remember the name, but it was a very beautiful play. So it is played in the Western theaters regularly. Nowadays, even in India, they are performing on like a part of or related to environment. So the other problem I see with most of the theater people is that like it's around the world, mostly they are very like fascinated nowadays towards the big screen or the small screen. So most of them wants to perform in front of the camera because it pays them. So that is the other point. But yeah, I think this is a very nice idea you brought. So maybe I can help you and interact with you about this later on. Now I open the session to participants. Kindly unmute yourself, raise your hand. Yes, Srinidhi, you raised your hand. I can see Sweta raised her hand. So maybe we can give the floor to Srinidhi first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashish, for answering my question. Another question I had is, what do you think is the role of education moving forward, especially in, say, indigenous communities and tribal populations? Because on the one hand, it may take them away from their roots and take them farther away, and it may not be relevant to their world. What it may also do is it may give them, say, a voice or empower them, or at least it may make them others take them seriously, which is not happening right now. So what do you think is the role of education?
Shrishtee, you want to try that first?
Yeah, I think the role of education and the form of education is something that people, communities are themselves questioning. And again, I will bring the example of a community that I have been associated with in central India. And one major challenge that during our conversation with them that they raised was that because of the modern education now, they don't usually use the local indigenous names for themselves. So they've basically started naming their children on whatever popular names are used in cities or whatever, and they feel that this is substantially to do with the whole cultural appropriation that is happening, and also the local education, which is primarily an education sponsored by the state, where indigenous cultures are looked down upon, their education, their ways of being are looked down upon, and their traditional education systems, like for Gond Adivasis, which is Gond indigenous people for the international audience, they have this system of Go tools, which was looked down upon when the British were here, and pretty much same was followed by the Indian administration of looking down upon this whole traditional system of education, where children were taught about their culture, their traditions, uh, their their traditional systems in a very lively and holistic manner. And people are questioning that. People are questioning it locally. There was something called here in Kochi, where I work with people. They started something called School for Life, G1 Shalas, and what they basically did was that children went to conventional schools where they were taught whatever conventionally is being taught, but through these Jivan Shalas, which people did it by themselves and organized it by themselves, where elders would come and tell about who were these indigenous, people who fought against the British, who also fought against British administration, because nobody is taught about who these indigenous fighters were. They were taught about others, but not really their local people. They also took them to their forest, talking about the birds, the plants, the trees, connecting them to their local ecologies. Um, they did this, and because of that, people who were involved in it, the young people who were involved in it, got a very different perspective of what it really means to be part of a collective. And eventually, when they got into the age of 18, 19, and 20, they became part of this whole transformative political process, so to say, where they were standing up against the whole district administration, fighting for protecting their forest and being part of these movements. Unfortunately, they had to stop this process because they didn't have enough money. They couldn't raise enough money. And I guess that's where the role of people like us is. How can we support these local processes, and how we can help them to take this forward? But that's something else. But people are thinking about these things, and they have other ways of engaging on these issues, other ways of actually looking at education, wherein they do see some merit in being able to be educated in conventional manner. They need it to be able to interact with the outside world, but also be rooted in their local context. And there are actually several examples. I'm giving the one that I'm more acquainted with, but there are several examples that we've documented in Vikalp Sangam, and also there are other parts of the world where people are doing that. There's another example from Mexico that I would like to give, but I guess I'm taking too much time, and I'll give Ashish the time to respond to this question.
No, I think you've kind of done justice to it in the time available. So if there's any remaining comment or question in the last minute or two that we have.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think Sweta raised her hand.
Yeah, thanks, Bharat. And thanks, Ashish
Sweta,
and Shrishtee.
Sweta, sorry, 1 second. Kindly everyone switch on your cameras for the group picture while Sweta speaks and address. We'll just take a group picture. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks, Ashish and Shrishtee. This was quite helpful for our community, because we know that we want to fight for this. We understand the essence of it in some way, but we were not able to explain this and really create awareness and talk to more young people about it. So I think what you guys explained to us was quite helpful to really make it more concrete in our head on how we can start, advocating and talking about this in the coming months and years. For sure. So my question was largely like, now that we're going forward in the GYBN community along the CBD process, we are currently in the process of doing consultations among young people. So all the chapter people who you see here, most of the people here who have come from different chapters, they are doing consultations where they're trying to gather the voices of young people, and then following that they are going to go and have conversations with their with decision makers in their countries, and then also conduct several advocacy actions at the national level, and we as GYBN will be doing it at the international level. So my question is largely like, how do you see the advocacy work that you guys are doing kind of linking with what we want to do, or do you have any advice on how we should take this topic forward and build it into the movement that we are already creating for all the other things? We are talking about intergenerational equity, we're talking about transformative education, and also we're talking about human rights and rights of nature. So I wanted to know, do you guys have any advice on how we all could take this forward into our journey towards the COP and the post 2020?
Yeah, I think it's my turn, so I'll just quickly respond to that, Shweta. So yeah, I think what we can do is try and work a bit more. I mean, obviously I can't respond to this fully in the next minute or two, but I think one of the things that works very well with so-called decision makers is examples. So we can argue the theoretical foundations of the kind of transformations that we want, how to live a biodiversity friendly life, etc., etc. But unless we're actually showing examples, saying, look, here's 20 different ways in which people are doing this around the world, or 500 different ways in which people are doing it, it doesn't become convincing. Assuming that the people you're talking to are open to being convinced. Of course, there are some who are, like Gandhiji said, you can wake up somebody who's sleeping, but you can't wake up somebody who's pretending to sleep. So there will always be people in government and positions of power who are, who listen politely to you, but not really be listening. But there are others who are actually listening and are open-minded. And that's where it really helps to both argue for the kinds of conceptual changes we want, but also then saying, okay, here's examples of whether it's sustainable farming, or it's food sovereignty, or it's community-led conservation, whatever biodiversity aspects and issues you're talking about. So that's where we can certainly collaborate, because we do have access to hundreds of examples from around the world, like I was saying, which you can use in your advocacy. And we can keep exchanging also on what we think are the things of, processes of advocacy that have worked and what has not worked. So yeah, I mean, let's just keep up this exchange. I can also say that the last thing, that maybe we could also do a fuller session with your core team and members on alternatives, because we've only really touched the surface of it here. I'm talking about holistic alternatives, not just individual sectoral alternatives, or more holistic transformations. Where are those sorts of things happening in different parts of the world? What are these examples, and what is emerging out of that? So maybe we can do a fuller session of that, which might help you also with your advocacy.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. Now that would really be helpful, and I think we could definitely reach back to you about how we can take it forward. Just to let you know, our entire community on Telegram is kind of going crazy with the stuff you guys are saying. People are like quoting you guys and putting it in the chat. So I think you really inspired the community quite a bit today. And I would really thank you guys for giving us this opportunity.
Not at all. It's a pleasure for us.
Thank you so much, Ashish. Thank you so much, Shrishtee. And thank you everyone for joining on a short notice. And I hope that you all have learned something new from here. And you can just check Kalpavriksh website, it's available. And you can go through what work they are doing. And definitely we would love to have you again, Ashish and Shrishtee, and any one of your team members. And I thank you, and I think now we will end this session here. And hopefully we will try to interact one more time next time. Thank you everyone for joining, and you all have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Rita.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.